All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the land of Chem. I am your host and the author. My name is Jeffrey Drum. Thank you all so much for joining me again. In this episode, I will be discussing the function of the step pyramid, which was the first installation in the series of chemical manufacturing facilities that were constructed on the western bank of the Nile River in Egypt. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I wanted to share this slide so that I could present some context in terms of the series of events that led up to the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. So I believe that there was a sophisticated ancient civilization that inhabited North and South America during the last ice age. And this civilization would have had existing knowledge of all of the sciences, from mathematics to geometry, astrology and cosmology, engineering, construction, physics, but more especially the knowledge of chemistry. And there was a massive catastrophe that ended the last ice age circa 10,000 BC. And it is conventionally accepted that a meteor struck this large ice cap that was covering the northern portion of North America that caused massive destruction to this North American civilization, and again caused the global flood, which we see that permeates all of the ancient mythology, basically across every civilization that has ever existed on the planet. So the survivors of this apocalyptic event, they would have been refugees that fled this catastrophe, and they would have traveled across the Atlantic Ocean in search of a new home. And as they arrived onto the western coasts of Ireland, Europe, Spain, and of course in Africa, they would have implemented their knowledge of science in constructions that would have given them a higher probability of survival. And what is a great way to do that other than using chemicals? We saw the same thing in our modern industrial revolution in terms of how it transformed our society. And again, this ancient civilization would have been no different, where they applied their knowledge of science to build these structures to produce chemicals, which again increased the probability of survival and made their civilization thrive in these new areas that they were now inhabiting. So let's say that, again, the refugees of this catastrophe arrived on the western coast of Africa, and they would have gradually traveled across the interior of the continent until they reached the Nile River in Egypt. So in this slide, this is a compilation of climatology data that was put together for the upper eastern portion of the Sahara Desert. And the Sahara Desert was not always a desert. There was a time period from 8500 BC to 5300 BC where this area was being transformed by monsoon rains into a vast, lush, fertile area that was primed for agricultural development. So again, let's say that our refugees that fled this catastrophe that destroyed their civilization in North America traveled across the interior of the African continent until they reached the Nile River in Egypt. And you see here, as indicated by these red dots, these are the centers of population density that existed during these time periods. So around 8500 BC, they would have arrived around the Nile River and began to reestablish their civilization within close proximity of the Nile River. Now, 8500 BC rolls around, and again, these monsoon rains begin to transform the region, again, into this lush habitat, again, that was just primed for agricultural development. So you see here, and again, this data is compiled using conventional archaeological and historical records. They know that the population gradually began to expand into these arable farmlands. And this is also the time period where we see the large-scale domestication of cattle. So the time frame of reference used in the land of Chem is circa 7000 BC, and Aquari and brother Julius are able to travel to Egypt and see the Egyptian pyramids in their full operation. And so let's say around 8500 BC, the civilization began to implement their knowledge of chemistry in large-scale, industrial-sized structures that could produce chemicals that would again allow their civilization to thrive in this new area. There's also, during this time period, the three essential reactants that are involved in the production of the chemical inside the step pyramid. And that would have been plentiful agricultural surplus, cattle manure, and water. And again, that large-scale domestication of cattle that we see during this time period would have been essential, again, to the operation of the step pyramid. And then we see here on the far right in this diagram that around the year 5300 BC, the monsoon rain stopped and the upper eastern portion of the Sahara was again returned to a vast desert. And the population gradually began to migrate back around the Nile River. And this is when we see the beginning of the dynastic Egyptian civilization, circa 3000 or 3500 BC. So we know that the Nile River was essentially the lifeblood of the Egyptian civilization. And this is very much the case in terms of the operation of the Egyptian pyramids. I mentioned in my previous videos that the pyramids were designed to work in conjunction with the annual Nile River flooding. As the Nile River would flood, the excess water was brought into the reservoir through the river temple and causeway system. The river temples were essentially inlets for this Nile River flooding. It allowed the water to enter the causeway. The water was conducted through the causeway into the reservoirs that surrounded the Egyptian pyramids, and the water was utilized within these structures either as a mechanism of the operation to produce the chemical reactions, and in most cases, as an initial chemical reactant in the production sequence. So we see here that there were three different seasons of the Egyptian year. You have the Akhet, which is the season of the inundation and the season of the flood. And this would have been the Egyptian season for chemical production. You also have the Peret, which is the growing season, and the Shemu, the harvesting season. So after the harvesting season, they would have collected all of the surplus agricultural material. They would have gathered up all of the cattle manure, and it would have been delivered to the step pyramid during the season of the Akhet to be used in the production of a certain chemical that we'll get to here in a little bit. Some of you may already know that have seen my videos on the SGD Sacred Geometry Decoded YouTube channel, or those of you that have purchased the book or follow my Instagram, right? You probably already know what we're getting to. But nonetheless, the three seasons of the Egyptian year also correspond to the season of the chemical production. Again, this was after the harvesting season. They collected all of this agricultural scrap, all of the cattle manure, brought it to the step pyramid to begin making chemicals. And I won't spoil the secret, but this is also connected to the symbolism of the scarab. We know that in the dynastic Egyptian religion, the scarab was a sacred symbol that represented the sun and resurrection. However, I believe that these ancient civilizations were also more practical. And the scarab, the dung-rolling beetle, that was also symbolic of the rolling and collection of the agricultural material and cattle dung that was utilized to produce these chemicals. Again, the scarab rolling and collecting the dung, the people collecting the agricultural scrap material and the cattle manure. It is a very comparable metaphor, again, which I believe was kind of reinterpreted in the dynastic Egyptian religion as more of a symbolic solar symbol or symbol of resurrection. But again, the connection between the scarab and the function of the step pyramid. So the next slide here, you can just see this green area which is the arable farmland that was created during the flooding of the Nile River. However, during the time frame of reference in the book, this entire area to the western portion of the Nile River would have also been farmland. And you can just see here that as the Nile River flooded, the river water would have come all the way up to the river temple. Again, that water was allowed into the inlet. The inlet was used to channel the water into the causeways, and the causeways delivered the water into the reservoirs that surrounded the Egyptian pyramids. I just really like this old map of the area in Saqqara surrounding the step pyramid. You can see here on the upper portion of this little map a structure called Jizr el Mudir, which I will be discussing in the second book. Yes, there is a second book. I reserved a lot of material was taken out of the first book and put aside to the second one. So if you've already read the first one, just hang tight. There is a second book coming, and there's many more secrets to be revealed in regard to the Egyptian pyramids and some of the ancient structures across the planet. So the story is definitely not over yet. But anyway, I really like this old map because you can see kind of indicated here where the water line would have reached during the flooding of the Nile River. And that actually continued into the modern day. You can see here in this slide how the Giza Plateau would have looked during the annual inundation of the Nile River. And this photo was taken sometime prior to the construction of the High Aswan Dam, which was actually built to prevent the Nile River from flooding. And it allowed the modern Egyptian civilization to come into existence. And thank you, Alan, for making these slides. He put in these little black silhouettes which depict Brother Julius and Aquari on their journey through the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids. And it really just resonates with the theme of the book, and he did such a great job. So, Alan, thank you so much for doing this. You're awesome. Again, this just shows that during the flooding of the Nile River, the water would have reached directly to the river temple. And this is just a quote from the book, from the chapter, The First Degree. And Brother Julius and Aquari travel from Ireland to Egypt over a month-long arduous journey, and they finally reach the harbor of Saqqara. And they get out of their boat, and they're walking up into the river temple, and the wind is sweeping off the Nile River to their back, and they go up this partially submerged walkway into the river temple, and Aquari is escorted by Brother Julius along the causeway to the step pyramid, where he is presented with the first degree and given the secrets of the step pyramid. So it was summer in Egypt, the peak season of the Akhet, and the inundated waters of the Nile River had already reached the threshold of the temple. And again, we know that these river temples were just inlets for Nile River water, which connected into the causeways. Again, here we have another great slide depicting Brother Julius and Aquari as they arrive at the step pyramid. And again, I just really love these black and white images. Alan, you did a fantastic job. However, when Brother Julius and Aquari arrived at the step pyramid, it would not have been this deteriorated structure that we now have today. It would have been a prime industrial manufacturing complex that would have looked something like this. And I really love these reconstructions and depictions of the step pyramid complex during its height. Again, this would have been a very impressive facility that was more indicative of an industrial manufacturing complex that, again, we know was used to produce chemicals. So here's just a couple of different renderings depicting the step pyramid. And you can really see that this would have been quite a sight, especially a young man traveling from rural Ireland to Egypt. He'd never seen anything like this before, so he becomes quite overwhelmed by what he's witnessing. Again, that's just part of the fictional narrative of the land of Chem, is painting the whole picture of the story of this young man's initiation into the order of Chem, which is the group that was responsible for the construction of the Egyptian pyramids when they settled in Egypt. Okay, so Where did this all begin? I mentioned in my previous videos that it was my experience inside the Red Pyramid that really led me to begin investigating the possibilities that the Egyptian pyramids were designed to produce chemicals. And as I began to research the modern industrial process for the production of ammonia, again, the Red Pyramid, it, it reeks of pure chemical ammonia, and there is very peculiar staining that covers the walls of the chambers. And the very unique configuration of this structure, there was some very precise engineering involved in the design of this structure. And I believe that it is because of the reduced volume in the upper portion of these chambers that they were able to compress certain gases, increase temperature and pressure to create chemical reactions. But nonetheless, as I began to investigate the modern process for the production of ammonia, I discovered that the two initial chemical reactants were methane and water. And this immediately caught my attention. I was very familiar with methane production and the techniques that were involved in creating it. I was well aware of the reactants that were involved. And take, for example, the sacred cow. Again, this animal is kind of a prevalent sacred symbol in many ancient civilizations, from the ancient Indians to the ancient Egyptians. They worship the cow. They worship cattle. And if the cattle manure was utilized in the production of an essential industrial chemical, there would have been more practical significance to this deification of these certain animals like the scarab or the cow. It just makes more sense to me that, again, there was a practical application involved that led to this symbolic representation. So again, the first two chemicals were methane and water. So again, I began to research the production of methane. I began to stumble across a series of diagrams that depict the modern structures that we use. They're called methane fermentation chambers or methane digestion chambers for the production of methane gas. And as I began to research and look at these diagrams, I immediately knew that they were compatible with one structure in particular, one Egyptian pyramid in particular, which is the step pyramid. So let's evaluate these diagrams and break this structure down into individual components. So here on the left side of the main digestion chamber, you have your mixing tank. And in this mixing tank, you would have created a slurry, which was a combination of water, ground up agricultural surplus material, can be basically any sort of agricultural material, and your cattle manure raw materials. And the reason for the use of the cattle manure contains essential bacteria that initiate the anaerobic digestion process. And it's the digestion of the raw materials by this bacteria that generates a mixture of gases, but the majority of which are methane. After you create your methane inside the fermentation chamber, it certainly has to be purified, and the step pyramid complex was designed to accomplish just that. But we'll get to that later on in the video. So again, you would have had a mixing tank or some sort of area where they produced the slurry. There was an inlet shaft leading into the primary digestion chamber. And then you have your outlet shaft, or you may call it a displacement shaft, and your overflow or displacement tank, where the digested material that was produced inside the fermentation or digestion chamber could then be collected. So this digested material was also a very valuable fertilizer, which could have been taken back to the farms and used to grow crops. So again, this was a very practical, very intelligent civilization that knew how to utilize the raw materials at their disposal to again produce chemicals that would have benefited their civilization and allowed them to thrive in their new home in Egypt. So here's just another diagram depicting two different types of biogas digesters, one that has a fixed dome and one that has a floating gas holder at the top of the digestion chamber. And again, if you break these down into individual components of a manufacturing process, you have your mixing pit, let's call it an adjacent temple to the pyramid. You have your inlet pipe, or let's call it the inlet shaft leading into the primary chamber. You have your, particularly down here in this depiction at the bottom, it doesn't get more clear of an indication that this is pointing to the configuration of the step pyramid, which we'll evaluate these side by side in just a moment. And then you have your outlet shaft or your displacement shaft, which leads to some sort of collection tank or displacement tank where your digested raw material can be collected. Okay, so keeping in mind the configuration of these modern biogas digesters, let's compare this to the configuration of the step pyramid. And one important thing to remember is that the step pyramid was not always a step pyramid. The structure was originally a single level platform, which they called a mastaba. And this structure underwent a series of renovations over time. So there would have been this original single level platform mastaba, and as the demand for the methane increased and the supply of the raw materials increased, the scale of production was also enlarged. The structure was enlarged to accommodate for the additional substrate material being produced, the volume of the gas that they were collecting, and again, the displacement of the raw materials. So again, the evolution of the step pyramid is an indication of the increase in production of this methane gas. So the first step of construction for the step pyramid, the central rectangular shaft would have been excavated from the bedrock, and your inlet and outlet shafts would have also been excavated from the bedrock. And you can see here in this depiction to the left that the original inlet shaft started here at point A, and it led into the digestion chamber. And this is coming in from the north. And you can see here your outlet shaft leading out to the south. And you can see here again on the lower portion that A right here is the original inlet. The inlet would have led into the digestion chamber, and there is a shaft leading out to the south. And now in some of these older diagrams, they do not depict the termination point of the southern shaft. This was actually not discovered until 2007 in the Latvian scientific mission to Saqqara, where they did ground penetrating radar and 3D imaging of the structure, and they put together the most accurate diagram of the step pyramid, which I'll show you here in just a moment. So again, let's look at this configuration on the right here, which is, this is actually the diagram that is outside of the step pyramid. And you can see here coming in from the left, the inlet shaft, and you would have had your mixing pit or an adjacent temple to the pyramid itself where your slurry was produced, again, using water, agricultural surplus, scrap material, and the cattle manure. The slurry would have been introduced into the chamber through this inlet shaft. It would have filled the chamber. And you see here that there is an open, you could almost call it a collection tank above the actual digestion chamber. And this is where your methane would have accumulated. And again, with the original single level platform, there would have been an outlet shaft or a collection shaft that led to the top of the platform where the gas could have been collected at the top of the platform. And again, in these depictions that we have here, it does not show that outlet shaft leading out to the south, but I will update you with that information in just a moment. Okay, so again, this is some images from that 2007 Latvian scientific mission in Saqqara. And again, this was the most scientific investigation and imaging of the step pyramid. And I can't say this enough, until we begin to thoroughly analyze these structures using modern technology like 3D imaging and ground penetrating radar, we will never understand the full scope of operations that were involved in these structures. When I toured Egypt, I kept getting the sense that what you saw above ground is only half of the picture. And there are shafts and tunnels, and there's no telling what is buried underneath the sands of the Sahara. And that is one of probably the great mysteries, and will probably forever remain a great mystery. But again, it's investigations like this that allow us to get a better understanding of these structures using modern imaging techniques, again, ground penetrating radar, which allowed us to discover that there is a shaft that leads from the central digestion chamber out to the south. And even our tour guide told us that the deep pit on the south side of the step pyramid complex was connected into the pyramid. And you can actually see this depicted here, this orange shaft that leads out to the south. This actually leads directly to the deep pit on the south side of the complex. And that would have been your displacement tank where, okay, so your slurry was produced here in the temple on the north side of the complex, and your agricultural material, your cattle manure and water, that would have been poured into the inlet shaft. The inlet shaft would have filled your primary digester. The methane would have been collected in the collection tank above the primary digester, and it could have been collected out of the structure in a collection shaft. And once the process was complete, the decomposed substrate material would have been collected out of this displacement shaft and again collected out of that deep pit on the south side of the structure. Now, you can see in this image that there are multiple tunnels. There is a tunnel system underneath this structure. And I do believe that this was actually created by the dynastic Egyptians. It is in these tunnels, which are very crudely excavated, that you find all of the funerary apartments of Djoser. I am well aware that they have found, pharaonic burial related items inside this structure. I just believe that the dynastic Egyptians repurposed what was already there. And again, I'll show some evidence of that later, that again, the funerary apartments were additions that came along much later. They were not portions of the original structure. And I discussed in my video with Alan, when we made a video on the step pyramid, that methane can also be collected from geological deposits. And you'll see here in some photos in just a minute that there is very unusual staining of the stone in this chamber. And it is entirely possible that the geological strata underneath the step pyramid could have been rich with naturally occurring methane deposits. And some of these shafts or tunnel systems could have also been excavated to increase the total output of the structure. Again, so they were utilizing this excess cattle manure and agricultural waste material to produce the methane gas, but they could have also been tapping into the natural geological deposits and creating this network of tunnels underneath the system to facilitate the production and again increase the total volume of the methane that was being produced inside the structure. Okay, so again, the components of the step pyramid, you just have the inlet shaft, your primary digestion chamber. And I want to make a note here that you can see this shaft leading into the top of the primary digestion chamber. This is actually a modern entrance, and this is where you would go in if you visit the structure today, and it leads into the top, and you take a scaffold of stairs down to the bottom of the structure. So this was not a part of the original structure. And again, the step pyramid underwent a series of renovations by the original builders, and then it was also repurposed by the dynastic Egyptians. So when you're evaluating these diagrams, it is very difficult to partition what was a portion of the original structure and then what was added later, which makes it very difficult to understand the inner workings of these. But again, if you break it down to its original components, the single level platform, the inlet shaft, the primary fermentation chamber, and the outlet displacement shaft to the south, it's really an indication of the structure's original purpose and its true function, which is the production of methane gas. And here on the right, you can see this deep pit on the south side of the structure. And again, when we were talking with our guide, he said he's been down there and the shaft system connects this deep pit into the primary digestion chamber underneath the step pyramid. Let me move myself out of the way here. All right, and now we can see a side-by-side comparison of, and this is from India, this one is from China. Again, I discussed with Alan in our video on the structures that the ancient Chinese were actually manufacturing methane, and they used it for rudimentary lighting purposes, for boiling water, for heat. They still use it today in places like rural India where small farm communities will have a small methane digester where they can produce the gas, again, to cook, to heat homes, for rudimentary lighting. This is a very, very ancient science. And part of the overall theory and, again, the bigger picture that I wanted to paint within the narrative of the land of Chem is that this ancient society was well versed in chemistry. Chemistry was the predominant science of this ancient civilization, and they would have utilized their knowledge, again, in these massive industrial scale structures to make these chemicals. It's not that much of a stretch of the imagination to consider that they had this sort of knowledge. Again, we know that they had knowledge of astrology, cosmology, mathematics, geometry. All of these sciences are embodied in the architecture of the pyramids. So again, the fact that they had an understanding of physics and chemistry is no stretch of the imagination. So again, let's just compare this one down here at the bottom. Again, you have your mixing pit, inlet shaft, digestion chamber, outlet shaft, and displacement tank. And then just compare that to the structure on the right, where this temple that was adjacent to the pyramid itself would have been your slurry production complex. So your raw materials would have been processed in this little temple. Again, the slurry was introduced into the primary fermentation chamber, primary digestion chamber. And again, the decomposed substrate material would have been collected out of the deep pit on the south side of the structure. Okay, so I mentioned before that the step pyramid underwent a series of renovations. And again, as supply of the raw materials and demand for the product increased, so did the scale of its production. And the step pyramid underwent a series of renovations that created Egypt's first true pyramid. And again, the complex that surrounded the structure was not originally there. Again, you can see here on the left, the yellow is your original single level mastaba platform. And on the bottom, you can see a top-down view. The second stage of renovations would have been an expansion to the base of the structure. And then they added 4 or 3 tiers above the original platform, which created a 4-stepped pyramid. And again, I believe this was for reinforcement purposes and also to expand the volume of the collection chamber inside. Because again, you're going to want to collect more methane as you're introducing more decomposed or more slurry material. And then again, the final stage of reconstruction, they added the last 2 tiers. The complex around the structure was built, which created, again, an industrial scale manufacturing plant where all aspects of the production cycle were incorporated into the facility, keeping everything within close proximity to the reaction chamber itself. And one indication that this structure was not originally intended for burial purposes is the fact that they extended the inlet shaft. Okay. So if this original mastaba was intended as a burial structure, you would have stuck your body down in there. And then if you expanded the complex or renovated the structure to make it more impressive, there would have been no need to extend the inlet shaft leading into the structure. Again, if it's intended for burial purposes, you want your burial to remain undisturbed and not create access into the actual burial chamber itself. So again, this is an indication that this was actually a functional portion of the structure. It was not intended for people to be going inside of it. And it was never intended for a body to be in here. When the dynastic Egyptians came back around, again, circa 3500, 3000 BC, they would have gained access to these structures and, of course, would have repurposed them for pharaonic burial purposes. We do see some evidence of that in the step pyramid. Again, I don't believe that was the original purpose. Again, I just really like these side-by-side comparisons because you can really see that the configuration of our modern biogas digesters are very compatible with the configuration of these structures. And you have to also remember, looking at this top-down version here on the left, that a lot of these tunnels were created by the dynastic Egyptians. So those were not portions of the original structure. Perhaps they were in terms of tapping into the geological strata, but it's difficult to say for sure. Here are just some old pictures of the original kind of excavation process of the step pyramid. You can see here, this is the entrance to the pyramid on the north. Again, this is the pictures on the left. This is the shaft leading down into your primary fermentation chamber. Here you can see some pictures of the galleries and the funerary apartments that were added into some of the tunnels underneath the structure. Again, I'm well aware that there are burial remnants found inside this structure, but when I show you the modern pictures, you can see that it's very clear that these were not parts of the original structure. They were literally plastered onto the walls, and the construction techniques of the dynastic Egyptians were not very sophisticated. The majority of the hieroglyphs that you see in these burial chambers, they're not actually carved into the stone. They are carved into a layer of plaster that was laid on top of the stone. And that's exactly what you see here in the step pyramid, that this faience glass and some of this white plaster material was added to the structure. Again, there's stela in the pyramid that depict the pharaoh Djoser. I'm well aware that there are depictions of the pharaoh inside this structure. I don't think they're part of the original structure, nor do I think that burial was the original purpose for these structures. All right, and here are just some modern pictures of, again, this is from the Asita project. Shout out to these guys. They did such an exceptional job depicting their unbelievable adventure to Egypt. And they really went to kind of research the measurements and just analyze the structures and really thoroughly document everything. Again, with great HD photos of some structures that I haven't, unfortunately, been able to gain access to yet. So anyway, this is the modern entrance into the structure. And you can see here the kind of dark color of the geological strata from which, or the bedrock rather, from which this original chamber was excavated. It's a very dark colored stone. It's a little bit unusual in terms of what you see in Egypt. Most stuff is sandstone and everything looks pretty yellow in terms of the color of the stone. So when I began investigating this structure, I found that is very unusual. Of course, if this was originally a fermentation chamber for cattle manure, you would certainly expect there to be some sort of discoloration on the inside of the chamber. Would that persist after thousands and thousands of years? I can't say for sure. I actually think this is the color of the stone, which again is a little bit unusual, but it may be an indication of those natural methane deposits. And again, it's decomposed agricultural material that gets locked up into this geological strata, which over a very long time produce natural deposits of methane gas. And it's possible that the builders of the original structure were tapping into these natural methane deposits. And again, here, this is the scaffolding that I mentioned that goes down into that primary digestion chamber. And again, you can just see the very dark coloring of the stone, of the bedrock from which this chamber was excavated. It's a little bit unusual. Okay, so these are some pictures of the funerary apartments of Djoser. Again, you can clearly see that the material used here is a plaster. It is literally plastered onto the walls. It's a very, very thin and I would say very, very rudimentary type of construction. And it does not appear to me that this was a part of the original structure. You can see here this black bedrock from which everything was excavated, and this white plaster material was literally kind of stuck in to decorate these tunnels for the burial of the Pharaoh Djoser, which I believe came along much, much later after these pyramids were no longer in operation. And again, this is probably one of my favorite pictures. I can't wait to go inside this structure myself. You can see here this wall of this kind of rudimentary brick and plaster material that was just sort of inserted in one of these excavated tunnels. Again, I do not believe that this funerary apartment was a part of the original structure. It was just repurposed for the pharaonic burial. And still, they've never found a pharaonic body in this structure. There is that rectangular granite container in the center, but it's never been opened. And I won't get into what that was actually for, but not for burial purposes, for the second book. Okay, so here's just another great diagram that shows the step pyramid complex in its full glory. Again, we know here that this temple adjacent to the pyramid on the north side would have been your slurry processing complex where that agricultural water and cattle manure slurry was produced. The mixture would have been introduced into the primary chamber. And again, we know from that Latvian scientific mission to Saqqara that there is actually a shaft leading out to the south that connects the primary digestion chamber with this deep pit here on the south side, and that would have been your displacement shaft from which the decomposed material was collected and returned to the farms, very, very valuable agricultural fertilizer. And you see here on the western portion of the step pyramid complex that there was a large series of what I would call silos that were constructed. And I'm not going to get into what those were used for or what this complex on the eastern side of the structure is for. For those of you that want to read the book, you can find out the full secrets of the structure. But again, this was an industrial scale methane manufacturing plant. And again, as the step pyramid underwent its renovations from the original single level platform into the 6-tiered structure, it became a very sophisticated operation. And they would have installed components that would have made the processing cycle and the production cycle more efficient. So I'm gonna just leave it at that and move on to the next one. You can see here in this blow up, this is just depicting the galleries inside the silo on the, again, there's 3 silos here on the western portion of the complex. And inside these silos, there were galleries, so storehouses all the way through them. And it's a pretty extensive structure. But again, this was a functional component, as was the, well, I won't say what it's for, but on the eastern side of the complex, there's also a facility that was installed there. And I really, really love this 3D rendering. Again, shout out to RF Morgan. I've seen his renderings on several different pyramids, and they are absolutely spectacular. Again, this is basically as close as you're going to get to kind of a 3D modeling of this. And again, it's just a really beautiful representation of the original majesty of these structures. Again, they would have been extremely impressive. This was, again, it was an industrial scale manufacturing plant. And as soon as you look at this, you really kind of get that sense. Again, we know that there is actually a shaft that connects the primary digestion chamber to this deep pit on the south. And if you look here at the bottom, you can see the inlet shaft going in to the primary fermentation chamber. And just envision, again, you see here on the far left, this deep pit on the south side, and that there is a shaft that connects these two pieces of the structure. And again, as that decomposed substrate material was displaced from the primary chamber, it could have gone down in that pit, collected the raw materials, and transported back to the farms for fertilizer use. Again, just another side-by-side comparison of your biogas digester and the step pyramid itself. Again, I really like this representation that shows the different phases of reconstruction. So the reconstruction is not just on the step pyramid. This is something that happened with all of the pyramids in Egypt. There were modifications and improvements to the structure as the knowledge of chemistry became more sophisticated. And that's really kind of the intention of the second book. I won't get into that anymore. Won't spoil the secret for you guys because it's going to be a good one. And here in these diagrams, so the evolution in the sophistication of the engineering and construction techniques is an indication of the progress that was accomplished in the knowledge of chemistry. So as their knowledge of chemistry became more sophisticated and they did experiments and had discoveries in terms of different chemicals and techniques used to produce them, you would have had structures that had more sophisticated engineering, more sophisticated physics that reflected those advances in chemistry. And you can see here, starting off with the step pyramid, it was a very, very simple structure. Inlet shaft, main chamber, outlet shaft. But as the knowledge of chemistry grew, you can see that the engineering that went into designing these structures is significantly more sophisticated. Again, when you go from the step pyramid to the red pyramid, there is a tremendous advance in terms of the engineering that was involved in producing the structure. Same when you go to the bent pyramid, which is in very close proximity to the red pyramid. Those two structures were actually designed to work in conjunction. I won't get into that. We'll save that for another video. And then, of course, when we finally get to the Great Pyramid of Giza, this was the pinnacle accomplishment of this ancient civilization. The Great Pyramid was absolutely a spectacular achievement, and it embodied all of the accumulated knowledge of this ancient civilization. Sacred mathematics and geometry, astrology and cosmology, engineering, physics, chemistry. Again, all of this was built into the structures. And I really do believe that these are literally universities of ancient knowledge. There is so much knowledge encoded into these structures, whether it be the proportions on the exterior, their layout on the plateau, and their layout across the western portion of the Nile. Again, there's connections to astrology and all sorts of other sciences. But again, my primary focus is just investigating the chemistry that was being accomplished on the interior of the structure. I'm not discounting any of those other components because, again, these are physical structures that embodied all of this accumulated knowledge. And I really do believe that these structures were intended to be interpreted and understood by later civilizations. So, they had anticipated that maybe these structures would one day go out of operation, and thousands and thousands and thousands of years down the line, that people would be able to measure these structures. They would be able to evaluate the interior components and extract that knowledge and, again, understand what their original intention was, which, again, I do not believe is for pharaonic burial. So, again, this is basically after my just wild experience inside the Red Pyramid. This is what I was envisioning in my mind, is that the pyramids of Egypt were literally chemical apparatus in large scale. So instead of your boiling flask or your beaker or your condenser column or your collection retort, You have your inlet shafts and your reaction chambers and your outlet shafts. So say, for example, I originally thought that the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid actually functioned like a condenser column. So let's take here the King's Chamber, kind of on the left in the center of the Great Giza Pyramid. Could be very easily compared to this boiling flask or boiling beaker or your primary reaction flask. And then the Grand Gallery, originally I thought this again was kind of a condenser column, and that the tiered vault within the Grand Gallery was designed to, again, allow gases to condense, form a liquid, so that the liquid could then be collected in your collection flask. After some investigation of the structure, I realized that that was not the case. But again, if you compare just a small laboratory scale chemical apparatus to the configuration of the pyramids, you have to break these pyramids down into individual units of a chemical manufacturing process. And there's an inlet shaft, there are reaction chambers, there are connection tubes or connection shafts, there are collection flasks, collection chambers. Again, once you begin to evaluate that from that perspective, it becomes a lot easier to really understand how these structures operated. And I just feel very, very lucky to have had this amazing experience in Egypt and be able to stumble across these correlations that led me into investigating the connection between chemistry and the Egyptian pyramids. So thank you to everyone. You know exactly who you are if you were involved in the process. I couldn't do this without you guys. All right. So I always get very excited when I get to this point in the video. It means I have finally finished recording successfully. And hopefully I will be able to maintain this video somewhat unedited. I really, really hope you enjoyed this episode on the Step Pyramid here on the Land of Chem YouTube channel. Of course, if you liked the video, please give it a like. If you didn't like it, whatever, I'm still going to keep making them. For those of you that are interested in reading the book, again, so the Land of Chem is a fictional story of a young man's initiation into an ancient society known as the Order of Chem. And the Order of Chem was established by these refugees that fled the catastrophe that destroyed their North American civilization. And they established this civilization that was in charge of preserving this sacred ancient knowledge and, again, utilizing it in the construction of these magnificent pyramids, which, again, were designed to produce chemicals that increased their probability of survival and allowed their civilization to thrive in their new home in Egypt. So again, if you're interested in purchasing the book and discovering the secrets of the Egyptian pyramids and also of the ancient passage chamber mounds of Ireland, because again, Aquari is from Ireland, and after he receives the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids, he returns home to Ireland and applies the knowledge that he gained through the degrees and his knowledge of chemistry to discovering the lost secrets of these ancient passage chamber mounds of Ireland, which were also used to produce chemicals. So the website is www.thelandofchem.com. For those of you that would like to purchase the book, it is available for digital download. I have some hard copies of the book coming out very, very soon. And I will, of course, keep everyone posted on my social media page, and follow me on Instagram at The Land of Chem. Thank you all so much for your support. It absolutely means everything to me. I really, really enjoy making these videos. I hope that you enjoy watching them. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you on the next episode. Thank you.